The radio crackled with static as Captain Sarah Martinez adjusted her helmet in the cockpit of her A-10 Thunderbolt II. Below her, the desert stretched endlessly, but ahead lay something far more treacherous than enemy fire, the prejudice of her own squadron. When the F-16 pilots saw her tail number appear on their mission boards, conversations stopped. Not because they respected her, but because they questioned whether a woman belonged in the cockpit of the most feared ground attack aircraft in the world. They called her plane ugly, the Warthog, they said, for an ugly pilot. They whispered that she'd gotten her wings through lowered standards, that she was a diversity hire in a man's war. What they didn't know was that Sarah Martinez was about to rewrite the rules of aerial combat, one mission at a time. When the order came down to ground her A-10, citing safety concerns and operational readiness, the same F-16 pilots who had mocked her would soon be begging for her call sign on the radio. This is the story of how one woman's determination to fly the deadliest close air support aircraft ever built would silence an entire fighter wing, not with words, but with precision, courage, and a willingness to prove that the sky belongs to anyone brave enough to claim it. Captain Sarah Martinez stepped off the transport plane at Bagram Air Base, Afghanistan, clutching her helmet bag and trying to ignore the stares. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac, where rows of aircraft gleamed in the harsh desert light. F-16 Fighting Falcons sat in perfect formation, their sleek profiles cutting elegant lines against the sky. But Sarah's eyes were drawn to the far corner of the airfield, where a different breed of aircraft waited. The A-10 Thunderbolt II looked nothing like its sophisticated cousins. Where the F-16s were all curves and grace, the A-10 was angular and brutal. Its massive GAU-8 cannon dominated the nose, and its straight wings seemed almost primitive compared to the swept-back design of modern fighters. The other pilots called it the Warthog, and not affectionately. To them, it was slow, ugly, and outdated. To Sarah, it was beautiful. She had dreamed of flying the A-10 since her first day at the Air Force Academy. While other cadets fantasized about air-to-air combat and supersonic speeds, Sarah was drawn to the A-10's mission, close air support. Getting down in the dirt with ground troops, providing the kind of precise, devastating firepower that could turn the tide of a battle. It was dangerous work, requiring pilots to fly low and slow, well within range of enemy ground fire. It demanded a different kind of courage than high-altitude dogfighting. The walk to the squadron building felt longer than it should have. Sarah could feel eyes on her from every direction. Ground crews paused in their work to watch her pass. Pilots emerging from briefing rooms stopped their conversations mid-sentence. She had expected this. In her 5 years of service, she had been the first woman in every assignment. Fighter training, survival school, weapons training, always the first, always fighting to prove she belonged. But this felt different. This wasn't just about being a woman in a man's profession. The A-10 community was smaller, tighter-knit than the broader fighter world. These pilots had been flying together for years, sharing dangers that most people couldn't imagine. They had watched each other's backs through countless missions, formed bonds forged in combat. And now here she was, an outsider, asking to join their brotherhood. The squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Hammer Peterson, was waiting for her in his office. Peterson was a legend in the A-10 community, with over 2,000 combat hours and 3 distinguished flying crosses. His withered face told the story of 2 decades in military aviation, and his eyes held the particular intensity of someone who had seen too much combat. When Sarah knocked on his doorframe, he looked up from a stack of mission reports with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Captain Martinez," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "Welcome to the 355th Fighter Squadron. I trust your flight over was uneventful?" "Yes, sir. Thank you for having me." Peterson leaned back in his chair, studying her for a long moment. "I'm going to be straight with you, Captain. Your arrival here has generated quite a bit of discussion. Some of my pilots have concerns." Sarah kept her expression neutral, though her heart was beating faster. "What kind of concerns, sir?" "The usual ones. Questions about whether you can handle the physical demands of the aircraft. Whether you have the temperament for close air support work. Whether bringing a woman into the squadron might affect unit cohesion." The word stung, but Sarah had heard variations of them before. "Sir, my training records speak for themselves. I graduated top 10% from A-10 training. My instructors rated me fully mission capable in all phases of operation." "I've read your file," Peterson said. "Impressive academics. Good stick and rudder skills. But training and combat are different animals, Captain. Out here, when ground troops are taking fire and calling for immediate support, there's no room for hesitation. No time for second guessing. My pilots need to trust each other completely. I understand that, sir. I'm here to do my job and support the mission. Peterson nodded slowly. I hope so. Because I'm going to be watching you closely, Captain. The first sign that you can't cut it, the first indication that your presence is affecting my squadron's effectiveness, and you'll find yourself on the next transport back to the States. Is that clear? Crystal clear, sir. Good. Major Williams will show you to your quarters and get you started on in-processing. Your first flight evaluation is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Don't disappoint me. Sarah saluted and left the office, trying to keep her composure. Major Rick Viper Williams was waiting outside, a tall, lean pilot with sun-bleached hair and laugh lines around his eyes. Unlike Peterson, Williams seemed genuinely friendly as he shook her hand. Don't let Hammer get to you, he said quietly as they walked down the hallway. He's tough on everyone, but he's fair. Prove yourself in the cockpit, and he'll have your back. What about the others? Williams glanced around, then lowered his voice. Mixed reactions. Some guys are curious to see what you can do. Others, well, let's just say they're not thrilled about the Air Force's diversity initiatives reaching their squadron. But here's the thing about A-10 pilots, we respect performance above everything else. Fly well, support the troops on the ground, bring your wingman home safe, and the rest will sort itself out. The living quarters were Spartan but functional. Sarah's room was in a converted shipping container, one of dozens arranged in neat rows across the base. She unpacked her few belongings and tried to settle in, but sleep was elusive. Tomorrow's evaluation flight weighed heavily on her mind. She knew it wasn't just about demonstrating her flying skills, it was about proving she deserved to be here. The next morning dawned clear and hot. Sarah arrived at the squadron building before sunrise, wanting to review the mission materials one more time. She found several other pilots already there, huddled around a coffee pot and speaking in low voices. The conversation stopped when she entered the room. Morning, she said, nodding to the group. A few mumbled responses came back. One pilot, a captain with snake embroidered on his flight suit, looked her up and down and shook his head. Can't believe they're really going through with this, he muttered, loud enough for her to hear. Sarah poured herself coffee and moved to a table where she could spread out her charts and checklists. She was reviewing the weather brief when someone sat down across from her. It was Captain Mike Torch Davidson, a stocky pilot with a reputation for aggressive flying and an even more aggressive personality. So you're the famous Sarah Martinez, he said, his voice carrying just enough sarcasm to be insulting without being overtly insubordinate. The first woman to fly the Hog in combat. How does it feel to be a trailblazer? It feels like being a pilot, Sarah replied evenly, not looking up from her charts. Right. Well, I hope you're ready for this. Flying the Warthog isn't like anything you did in training. When you're down in the weeds with people shooting at you, things get real pretty fast. Some people freeze up. I won't freeze up. Torch laughed. That's what they all say. But you never know until you're there. Until someone's depending on you to save their lives and everything's going to hell around you. That's when you find out what you're really made of. Sarah finally looked up from her charts, meeting his gaze directly. I guess we'll find out. The briefing for her evaluation flight was conducted by Major Williams, who would be flying as her instructor pilot in a two-seat A-10. The mission was straightforward, basic aircraft familiarization, some tactical maneuvering, and weapons delivery on a practice range. Nothing she hadn't done dozens of times in training, but somehow it felt different with half the squadron watching her every move. As they walked out to the aircraft, Sarah could feel the weight of expectations pressing down on her. The ground crew seemed unusually attentive, stealing glances as they performed their pre-flight inspections. Other pilots found reasons to be outside, checking on their own aircraft or simply enjoying the morning air. She knew they were all waiting to see if she would live up to the hype or prove their skeptics right. The A-10 that would be hers for the evaluation was tail number 80-0247, an aircraft with a distinguished combat history. Williams pointed out the mission marks painted below the cockpit, small bombs and bullets indicating successful combat sorties. This bird's been to war, he said. Respect her, and she'll bring you home safe. Sarah ran her hands along the aircraft's skin, checking for damage or loose panels. The A-10 was built like a tank, with redundant systems and armor plating designed to keep flying even after taking heavy damage. Its twin engines were mounted high on the fuselage to reduce the chance of foreign object damage, and the cockpit was surrounded by a titanium bathtub that could stop armor-piercing rounds. Everything about the aircraft spoke to its mission: survivability in a hostile environment. Strapping into the cockpit felt like coming home. Sarah had spent hundreds of hours in A-10 simulators and training aircraft, but there was something different about this moment. This was her combat debut, her chance to prove that all the training and preparation had been worth it. She ran through her checklist methodically, calling out each item to Williams in the rear seat. "Looking good up there, Martinez," Williams said through the intercom. "Take your time. This isn't a race." Engine start was smooth, the twin General Electric turbofans spooling up with their distinctive whine. Sarah tested the flight controls, watching the massive ailerons and elevators move in response to her inputs. Everything felt solid and responsive. She called for taxi clearance and began the slow roll toward the runway. Other aircraft were launching that morning: F-16s heading out for air-to-air training, tankers beginning their long orbits, helicopters lifting off for transport missions. But Sarah's attention was focused entirely on her own aircraft and the task ahead. This wasn't just a check ride, it was the beginning of her combat career. As they approached the runway, Williams came on the intercom again. "Okay, Martinez. This is your show. Fly it like you trained, trust your instincts, and remember, the A-10 is a forgiving aircraft. She'll take care of you if you take care of her." Sarah keyed her radio. "Tower, Hog 21 ready for departure. Hog 21, cleared for takeoff. Fly safe." She pushed the throttles forward, feeling the aircraft surge ahead. The A-10 wasn't fast, but it was powerful, and the acceleration pressed her back into her seat. At rotation speed, she pulled back gently on the stick, and the aircraft lifted smoothly into the desert air. Below them, Bagram Air Base shrank to miniature size. The sprawling complex of runways, buildings, and defensive positions looked almost peaceful from altitude. But Sarah knew the reality on the ground was far different. Somewhere out there, troops were on patrol, facing an enemy that could strike without warning. Soon, she might be called upon to support those troops, to provide the kind of close air support that could mean the difference between life and death. For now, though, she had to focus on the evaluation. Williams directed her through a series of basic maneuvers: climbs, descents, turns at various airspeeds. The A-10 responded predictably, without any of the twitchy handling characteristics of higher performance fighters. It felt solid and dependable, like a tool built for a specific purpose. "Good work," Williams said as they headed toward the practice range. "You're flying the aircraft well. Now let's see how you do with some tactical work." The weapons range was located in a remote valley surrounded by mountains. Old tanks and armored vehicles served as targets, their hulks scarred by years of training missions. Sarah descended to attack altitude, scanning the area for threats and reference points. This was where the A-10 truly shined, down low, where precision mattered more than speed. "I want you to make a gun run on the tank at the north end of the range," Williams instructed. "Set up your attack heading, call your target in sight, and show me a smooth delivery." Sarah banked the aircraft toward the target, aligning her attack heading with the valley floor. The GAU-8 cannon was the A-10's primary weapon, a 7-barrel Gatling gun capable of firing 4,200 rounds per minute. Each bullet was the size of a milk bottle, designed to penetrate tank armor and destroy vehicles with devastating effectiveness. But accuracy required precise flying and perfect timing. "Target in sight," she called, beginning her attack run. The target grew larger in her windscreen as she descended, the crosshairs of her gun sight tracking across the landscape. At the proper range, she squeezed the trigger, feeling the aircraft shudder as the massive cannon opened fire. The sound was like thunder, a deep roar that seemed to shake the entire aircraft. Tracers arced toward the target, kicking up clouds of dust and debris. Sarah held the trigger for exactly 2 seconds, then pulled up sharply, banking away from the target area. Below, smoke and dust marked where her bullets had impacted. "Nice run," Williams said. "Good tracking, good pull-off. Let's try it again with some simulated ground fire." They made several more passes, with Williams calling out simulated threats that Sarah had to avoid while still delivering accurate fire on target. Each run felt smoother than the last, the aircraft becoming an extension of her will rather than a machine she was operating. This was what she had trained for, what she had dreamed of since her academy days. As they headed back to base, Williams was quiet for several minutes. Finally, he keyed the intercom. "Martinez, I'm going to give it to you straight. That was some of the best flying I've seen from a new pilot in a long time. You handled the aircraft like you'd been flying it for years. Your weapons delivery was textbook perfect." Sarah felt a surge of relief and pride, but she kept her voice professional. "Thank you, sir. The aircraft flies beautifully." "It does, but only if you know how to fly it. And you clearly do. I'm going to recommend you for immediate mission qualification. That means you'll start flying combat missions within the week." The landing back at Bagram was smooth, and, as they taxied back to the parking area, Sarah could see the other pilots waiting. Some looked curious, others skeptical. A few seemed almost disappointed that she hadn't crashed or embarrassed herself. But their opinions mattered less now than they had that morning. She had proven to herself, and to Williams, that she belonged in the cockpit of an A-10. As they shut down the engines and began their post-flight procedures, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond the successful evaluation. She was finally, where she had always wanted to be, a combat pilot, ready to support troops on the ground and prove that the sky truly belonged to anyone brave enough to claim it. The real test, however, was yet to come. The call came at 0347 hours, dragging Sarah from a restless sleep. The red phone beside her cot was reserved for scramble alerts, its shrill ring cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a knife. She grabbed it before the second ring, instantly alert despite having been asleep moments before. "Captain Martinez, report to ops immediately. We have troops in contact," came the voice of the operations officer. Sarah was dressed and running toward the operations building within 3 minutes, her flight suit only half-zipped and her helmet bag bouncing against her hip. The base around her was coming alive with the controlled urgency of a combat scramble. Red lights strobed along the flight line, and the whine of starting engines filled the air. The operations center was a hive of activity. Large screens displayed satellite feeds and tactical maps, while radios crackled with transmissions from various aircraft and ground units. Lieutenant Colonel Peterson stood at the center of it all, coordinating the response to what was clearly a significant engagement. "Martinez," he called when he saw her enter. "You're flying Chalk 2 with Davidson. We have a platoon of Marines pinned down in the Cunard Valley, taking heavy fire from multiple positions. They need immediate close air support." Sarah's pulse quickened. This was it, her first real combat mission. Everything she had trained for, everything she had worked toward, was about to be put to the test. She nodded to Peterson and moved to where Captain Torch Davidson was studying a tactical map with the other pilots. Davidson looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. "Well, looks like you're going to get your baptism by fire, Martinez. This isn't going to be some training exercise. Real bullets, real people depending on us." "I'm ready," Sarah replied, meaning it. Major Williams appeared at her shoulder. "Sarah, I know this is your first combat mission, but don't overthink it. Fly the aircraft like you did yesterday, listen to the JTAC on the ground, and trust your training. These Marines are counting on us." The briefing was rapid but thorough. A Marine patrol had been ambushed while investigating reports of insurgent activity in a remote valley. The enemy had chosen their position well, rocky terrain that provided excellent cover and multiple escape routes. The Marines were pinned down in a small compound, taking fire from at least 3 different positions. Helicopter evacuation was impossible due to the enemy fire, and ground reinforcements were still hours away. "Weather's good, visibility unlimited," the intelligence officer reported. "But be aware that the terrain is extremely rugged. Mountains on 3 sides, limited maneuvering room. The enemy positions are well concealed and have been engaging our forces for over an hour." Sarah studied the satellite imagery, memorizing the layout of the valley and the positions of friendly forces. The compound where the Marines were trapped was clearly marked, surrounded by the rocky outcroppings that hid the enemy fighters. It would require precise navigation and careful weapons delivery to support the ground forces without causing friendly fire incidents. "Rules of engagement are weapons-free in designated areas only," Peterson continued. "You will not engage any target without positive identification and clearance from the ground controller. These people have been fighting in this terrain for centuries, they know how to use it to their advantage. Davidson would be the flight lead, with Sarah flying as his wingman. Their call signs would be Hog 51 and Hog 52. They would carry a mixed load of weapons, the GAU-8 cannon, rockets, and precision-guided bombs. Whatever the situation required, they would be ready to deliver. The walk to the aircraft felt different this time. There was an electricity in the air, a sense of urgency that hadn't been present during training flights. Ground crews worked with practiced efficiency, loading weapons and conducting final checks. The ordnance looked more menacing somehow, knowing it would soon be used in anger. Sarah's A-10 for this mission was tail number 78-0685, an older aircraft with even more combat experience than the one she had flown the day before. The mission marks below the cockpit told stories of battles in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other conflicts around the world. As she conducted her pre-flight inspection, she found herself touching the aircraft almost reverently. This machine had brought other pilots home safely from missions just like this one. Hog 52, how you doing over there? Davidson's voice came through the radio as they strapped in. Ready to go, lead, Sarah replied, running through her startup checklist. Engine start was routine, but everything felt different knowing they were heading into combat. Sarah tested her weapons systems, verifying that all her ordnance was properly configured and ready to deploy. The GAU-8 cannon showed 1,174 rounds of 30mm ammunition, each round capable of destroying a vehicle or fortified position. As they taxied toward the runway, Sarah could see F-16s returning from their own missions, their sleek forms contrasting sharply with the brutal functionality of the A-10s. The difference in aircraft seemed to symbolize the difference in missions. The F-16s fought clean, high-altitude battles against other aircraft, while the A-10s got down in the dirt with the ground troops, sharing their dangers and fighting their battles. Bagram Tower, Hog 51 flight of 2, ready for immediate departure, Davidson called. Hog 51, you're cleared for takeoff. Good hunting. The takeoff roll seemed longer than usual, the aircraft heavy with fuel and ordnance. But, once airborne, the A-10 felt solid and reliable, ready for whatever lay ahead. They climbed out to the northeast, heading toward the Cunard Valley and their first taste of real combat. The flight to the target area took 25 minutes, during which Sarah checked and rechecked her systems while monitoring the radio chatter between other aircraft and the battlefield controllers. The situation on the ground was clearly deteriorating. The Marines were running low on ammunition and had taken several casualties. Medical evacuation was impossible until the enemy fire could be suppressed. Hog Flight, this is Chaos 35, the ground controller, came a voice over the radio as they approached the target area. The calm professionalism in the Marine's voice couldn't quite mask the stress of someone under fire. We have troops in contact in Grid 41 RQR 123456. Taking effective fire from multiple positions. Request immediate close air support. Chaos 35, Hog 51, Davidson responded. Flight of 2 A-10s inbound your location. We're carrying mixed ordnance and ready to support. What can you tell us about enemy positions? Hog 51, we're taking fire from 3 confirmed positions. Primary threat is a machine gun nest in the rocks about 400 meters north of our position. Secondary positions are roughly northeast and northwest. Danger close is 150 meters from our compound. Sarah felt her mouth go dry. Danger close meant that the enemy was within 150 meters of friendly forces, close enough that any missed shot could cause friendly casualties. This was the most challenging type of close air support, requiring absolute precision and perfect communication between air and ground forces. As they approached the valley, the terrain below revealed itself to be even more challenging than the satellite imagery had suggested. Jagged ridges and deep ravines created a maze of shadows and hiding places. The compound where the Marines were trapped looked tiny and vulnerable, surrounded by the rocky heights that concealed their attackers. Tally the compound, Davidson called, spotting the friendly position. Hog 52, do you have it in sight? Affirmative, lead. I see the compound and the smoke from their marking round. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from the enemy positions now, tiny sparks of light among the rocks where insurgent fighters were firing down at the trapped Marines. The tactical situation was clear, the enemy had chosen their positions well, with excellent fields of fire and multiple escape routes through the rocky terrain. Chaos 35, Hog 51 has you in sight. We need to work the primary target first. Can you mark it with smoke? Working on it, Hog 51. Smoke out. A white phosphorus round detonated among the rocks north of the compound, marking the general area of the machine gun position. But, the enemy position itself remained invisible among the jumbled terrain. This was the reality of close air support in Afghanistan. Targets that were obvious to troops on the ground could be nearly impossible to spot from the air. "I don't have a clear visual on the target," Davidson transmitted. "The terrain's too broken up. We're going to have to work off your directions." "Roger that, Hog 51. The target is approximately 50 meters east of the smoke, in a cluster of large boulders. You should be able to see a shadow line where the rocks create an overhang." Sarah scanned the area desperately, trying to pick out the enemy position among the confusing landscape below. There, a darker patch among the rocks that could be the overhang the controller was describing. But, she couldn't be certain, and uncertainty was deadly in close air support. "Lead, I think I see the target area," she called. "The shadow line about 50 meters east of the smoke? That's what I'm looking at too. Chaos 35, we're going to make a gun run from south to north. Confirm all friendly forces are in the compound and under cover." "All friendlies are in the compound, Hog 51. You're cleared hot." Davidson banked into his attack run, diving toward the target from the south. Sarah followed, spacing herself to attack from a slightly different angle. This was the moment when months of training would either prove sufficient or come up fatally short. "Hog 51 in hot," Davidson called, beginning his attack. The GAU-8 cannon opened fire with its distinctive sound, a deep, grinding roar that seemed to tear the air apart. Tracers arced toward the target, kicking up clouds of dust and rock fragments among the suspected enemy position. Good hits," came the excited voice of the ground controller. "You're right on target. The machine gun has stopped firing." Sarah rolled in for her own attack, the target area now marked by the dust and smoke from Davidson's gun run. She lined up carefully, checking her altitude and airspeed, making sure she was well clear of the danger close line. The GAU-8 crosshairs tracked across the rocky terrain as she refined her aim point. At the proper range, she squeezed the trigger. The aircraft bucked and shuddered as the massive cannon fired, sending 30mm rounds screaming toward the target. She could see her tracers impacting among the rocks, adding to the destruction begun by her flight lead. "Hog 52 off target," she called, pulling up sharply and banking away from the attack area. "Outstanding work, both aircraft," Chaos 35 transmitted. "The primary position is neutralized. But we're still taking fire from the northeast position. Can you work that target next?" The second enemy position proved even more challenging than the first. Located on a steep ridgeline with numerous hiding places, it took 3 attack runs by each aircraft before the ground controller reported that the firing had stopped. Sarah was amazed by the amount of ammunition the enemy fighters had absorbed before being neutralized, a testament to the protective qualities of the rocky terrain. "Hog flight, we've got movement in the northwest position now," Chaos 35 reported. "Looks like they're trying to reposition to continue the engagement. This target would require a different approach." The enemy fighters were moving through a narrow ravine, presenting only fleeting opportunities for engagement. Davidson decided to use rockets rather than the cannon, hoping to catch the insurgents in the open ground between rocky outcroppings. "I'm going to put rockets into the ravine mouth," Davidson announced. "That should discourage any movement through that area." His rocket attack was perfectly placed, sending 2.75-inch rockets into the narrow defile where the enemy fighters were moving. The explosions echoed off the valley walls, and large chunks of rock came tumbling down from the ravine sides. When the smoke cleared, there was no further movement in the area. For the next hour, the two A-10s maintained orbit over the battlefield, ready to engage any new threats that might emerge. Sarah found herself constantly scanning the terrain below, looking for signs of enemy movement or muzzle flashes that might indicate renewed fighting. The concentration required was exhausting. Every shadow could hide an enemy fighter, every movement could signal a new threat to the Marines below. Finally, the radio crackled with good news. "Hog flight, Chaos 35. We have ground reinforcements approaching our position. The immediate threat appears to be neutralized. You guys did an outstanding job today." "Roger that, Chaos 35, Davidson replied. "Glad we could help. We'll remain on station until the reinforcements arrive." As they circled above the compound, Sarah could see vehicles approaching through the valley, the ground reinforcements that would finally allow the trapped Marines to be evacuated. The mission was almost over, but she knew this was just the beginning. There would be many more calls like this one, many more troops depending on their ability to deliver precise, devastating firepower when it was needed most. The flight back to Bagram was quiet, both pilots lost in their own thoughts about what they had just experienced. Sarah replayed every moment of the mission in her mind, analyzing her performance and looking for areas where she could improve. The weight of responsibility was enormous, real people had depended on her skills today, and any mistake could have resulted in friendly casualties or mission failure. As they approached the airfield, Davidson broke the silence. "Not bad for a first mission, Martinez. You flew well and kept your head under pressure. That's what matters in this business." "Thank you, lead." It was different from training, but the aircraft performed exactly like it was supposed to. That's what the Warthog does, takes care of the people who take care of it. You handled yourself like a professional today. The Marines on the ground are alive because of what we did. The landing was routine, but as they taxied back to the flight line, Sarah could see that word of their mission had already spread. Ground crews and other pilots were waiting to hear about the engagement, and she could see the respect in their eyes that hadn't been there the day before. She had proven herself in combat, and, in the A-10 community, that was the only currency that mattered. During the mission debrief, Lieutenant Colonel Peterson listened carefully to their account of the engagement. "Sounds like you handled a difficult situation professionally," he said when they finished. "The Marines are already sending their thanks through channels. Well done, both of you." As Sarah walked back to her quarters that evening, she felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond the successful completion of her first combat mission. She had proven to herself and others that she could handle the pressure and responsibility of close air support. But, more importantly, she had saved lives. Somewhere, Marines were going home to their families because of what she and Davidson had accomplished that day. The other pilots' attitudes toward her had shifted noticeably. Where before there had been skepticism and barely concealed hostility, now there was a grudging respect. She had been tested in combat and had not been found wanting. In the warrior culture of the fighter squadron, that was the ultimate validation. But Sarah knew this was just the beginning. One successful mission didn't make her a seasoned combat pilot. There would be more challenges ahead, more tests of her skill and courage. And, somewhere in the back of her mind, she wondered what would happen when the pressure really mounted, when the bureaucrats and politicians decided that having a woman flying combat missions was too controversial to continue. 3 weeks after her first combat mission, Sarah Martinez had flown 14 more sorties, each one adding to her reputation as a skilled and reliable pilot. The initial skepticism from her squadron mates had largely evaporated, replaced by the professional respect that combat pilots reserved for those who had proven themselves under fire. But, as her success in the cockpit grew, so did the political pressure building against her continued presence in the squadron. The first sign of trouble came during a routine mission briefing. Sarah was studying intelligence reports when Major Williams approached her with an expression she had never seen before, a mixture of anger and frustration that immediately put her on alert. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said quietly, glancing around the briefing room to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "There's some political nonsense brewing that you need to know about." They walked outside into the harsh morning sun, where Williams lit a cigarette with hands that weren't quite steady. "I just got off a video conference with some Pentagon staffers. Apparently, there are people back in Washington who aren't happy about having a female pilot flying A-10s in combat." Sarah felt her stomach drop. She had known this day might come, but the timing couldn't have been worse. The squadron was in the middle of a particularly active period, with missions launching daily to support ground operations throughout Afghanistan. The last thing they needed was political interference. "What kind of people?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Conservative members of Congress, mostly. They're saying that putting women in direct combat roles violates the spirit of the combat exclusion policy, even if it doesn't technically violate the letter of the law. They're pressuring the Air Force to clarify its position on female pilots in close air support roles." The combat exclusion policy had been a source of controversy for years. While it technically prohibited women from serving in units whose primary mission was direct ground combat, the policy had been interpreted to allow female pilots to fly combat missions since they weren't technically infantry or armor troops. But the distinction was murky, especially when it came to close air support missions where pilots worked directly with ground forces in contact with the enemy. "Have they made any specific demands?" Sarah asked. Williams took a long drag on his cigarette before answering. They want the Air Force to conduct a comprehensive review of current policies regarding female pilots in combat roles. In the meantime, they're suggesting that female pilots be reassigned to less controversial positions pending the outcome of the review. Less controversial positions. Like flying cargo planes or sitting behind a desk. Something like that. The good news is that Colonel Peterson and the wing commander are fighting it. They've made it clear that you're a valuable asset and that removing you would hurt mission effectiveness. But there's only so much they can do if the pressure from Washington gets intense enough. Sarah stared out at the flight line, watching ground crews prepare aircraft for the day's missions. She had worked too hard and come too far to let political considerations end her combat flying career. But she also knew that military officers who bucked the political system too hard often found their own careers in jeopardy. Is there anything I can do? Keep flying well and keep bringing everyone home safe. The best argument against the politicians is continued mission success. If you can prove that having you here makes the squadron more effective, not less, it becomes harder for them to justify removing you. That afternoon, Sarah found herself paired with Captain Snake Reynolds for a close air support mission in the Helmand Valley. Reynolds had been one of her most vocal critics during her first weeks in the squadron, questioning both her flying skills and her right to be there. But combat had a way of changing perspectives, and Reynolds had gradually come to respect her abilities, even if he still had reservations about women in combat roles. The mission briefing revealed a complex tactical situation. Army Rangers had been conducting a night raid on a suspected Taliban command post when they encountered heavier resistance than expected. Now pinned down in a small village, they needed close air support to suppress enemy positions and create an escape route back to their extraction point. This is going to be tricky, Reynolds said as they studied the mission materials. Urban environment, lots of civilian structures, troops scattered across multiple positions. We're going to have to be very precise with our weapons delivery. Sarah nodded, already visualizing the challenges they would face. Urban close air support was among the most difficult missions an A-10 pilot could fly. The dense concentration of buildings made target identification difficult, while the presence of non-combatants meant that any mistake could result in civilian casualties and international incidents. Their A-10s were loaded with a carefully selected mix of weapons, the GAU-8 cannon for precise targeting, small-diameter bombs for minimal collateral damage, and rockets for area suppression. Everything was designed to provide maximum effectiveness while minimizing the risk to innocent bystanders. The flight to the target area took 40 minutes, during which they monitored radio chatter from the battlefield. The situation was clearly deteriorating, the Rangers were running low on ammunition and had taken several casualties. Helicopter extraction was impossible due to enemy fire, and ground reinforcements were still hours away. As they approached the village, Sarah could see why the Rangers were having such difficulty. The Taliban had chosen their defensive positions well, using the maze of narrow streets and tall buildings to create overlapping fields of fire. Smoke drifted up from several locations where explosions had damaged structures, and she could see muzzle flashes from multiple windows and rooftops. Hog 31, this is Ranger 6, came the voice of the ground controller, speaking in the clipped, professional tones that barely concealed the stress of someone under heavy fire. We have troops in contact throughout the village. Primary threat is a machine gun position in the three-story building at grid 41 SMB 789123. Secondary threats are sniper positions in buildings to the north and east. Reynolds keyed his radio. Ranger 6, Hog 31 flight of 2 inbound your location. We have mixed ordnance and are ready to support. Can you mark the primary target? Negative on smoke, Hog 31. Too much enemy fire to expose our position. The target building has green doors on the ground floor and is missing part of its roof from previous engagement. Sarah scanned the village below, trying to identify the target building among the dozens of similar structures. The description could fit several buildings, and the angle of their approach made it difficult to see details like door colors. This was exactly the kind of situation where mistakes happened, unclear target descriptions leading to attacks on the wrong buildings. Snake, I'm not getting a clear picture of the target, she transmitted on their internal frequency. Me neither. We're going to have to work with the ground controller to get better target identification. Reynolds contacted the ground controller again. Ranger 6, we need better target identification. Can you give us a more specific description or use an IR pointer? Hog 31, the target is the tallest building on the main road running north-south through the village. It's about 200 meters north of the mosque with the blue dome. That helped narrow it down, but Sarah still wasn't completely confident in her target identification. In the urban environment, perspective and shadows could make buildings appear different from the air than they did from ground level. The last thing she wanted was to attack the wrong building and cause civilian casualties. "I think I have the target," Reynolds called. The three-story building with the damaged roof, about 200 meters north of the mosque. "Do you concur?" Sarah studied the building Reynolds had identified. It matched the description and was in approximately the right location, but something about it didn't feel right. The building looked too clean, too undamaged for a structure that had supposedly been the center of a firefight for the past hour. "Lead, I'm looking at the same building, but I'm not certain. There's another three-story building about 100 meters to the east that also has a damaged roof." "Damn it, you're right. Ranger 6, we have two buildings that match your description. We need definitive target identification before we can engage." The ground controller's response was strained. "Hog 31, we're taking heavy fire from both buildings. The primary threat is the one closest to the main road. We need immediate suppression or we're going to take more casualties." Reynolds made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. "Roger that, Ranger 6. We're going to use small-diameter bombs on both buildings. That should neutralize the threats while minimizing collateral damage." "Wait," Sarah called on their internal frequency. "Are we sure there are no civilians in either building?" Ranger 6 confirmed the area had been cleared of non-combatants before the operation began, Reynolds replied, his voice showing the stress of making split-second decisions under pressure. "We can't let perfect be the enemy of good here. Those Rangers need support now." Sarah knew Reynolds was right from a tactical standpoint, but something still bothered her about the target identification. In training, they had been taught never to attack a target unless they were absolutely certain it was legitimate. But training and combat were different animals, and the lives of American troops hung in the balance. "Hog 31 in hot," Reynolds called, beginning his attack run on the building closest to the main road. Sarah watched as the small-diameter bomb separated from his aircraft and guided itself to the target with laser precision. The explosion was relatively small but effective, collapsing part of the building's upper floor and sending smoke and debris flying through the air. "Good hit, Hog 31, came the relieved voice of the ground controller. "Firing from that position has stopped. Can you work the second building now?" "Hog 32, you're cleared hot on the eastern building," Reynolds transmitted. Sarah rolled in for her attack, but as she lined up on the target, she caught sight of movement in a ground floor window that made her heart skip a beat. For just a moment, she thought she saw someone who didn't look like a fighter, someone who might be a civilian trapped in the building. "Hog 32, aborting," she called, pulling up sharply without releasing her weapon. "What's wrong?" Reynolds demanded. "Possible civilian in the target building. I saw movement in the ground floor that didn't look right." "Ranger 6, can you confirm no civilians in the eastern target building?" Reynolds called. "Hog 31, the building was supposed to be clear, but we can't be certain. There's been too much chaos to verify." The tactical situation was rapidly deteriorating. Without suppression of the second enemy position, the Rangers remained pinned down and vulnerable. But attacking a building that might contain civilians would be an unthinkable violation of both military law and basic human decency. "I'm going to make a gun run instead," Sarah announced. "I can put cannon fire through the upper floor windows where the muzzle flashes are coming from. That should neutralize the threat without endangering anyone on the ground floor." It was a much more difficult shot than dropping a bomb, requiring pinpoint accuracy while flying at high speed and low altitude. But it was the only way to support the ground troops while minimizing the risk to potential civilians. Sarah lined up for another attack run, this time focusing on the specific windows where she had seen muzzle flashes. The GAU-8 cannon could be precisely aimed, allowing her to target individual rooms rather than entire buildings. As she approached the release point, she could see enemy fighters firing from the windows, confirming that the building was indeed a legitimate target. The cannon burst was perfectly placed, sending 30mm rounds through the windows where the enemy fighters were positioned. The building's upper floor erupted in clouds of dust and debris, and the firing from that position immediately ceased. "Outstanding shot, Hog 32, Reynolds called. "Ranger 6, how does that look from your position?" "Both threats are neutralized, Hog Flight. You've given us the breathing room we needed." Medical evacuation is inbound, and we should be able to reach our extraction point within the hour. As they provided overhead cover for the Rangers' withdrawal, Sarah reflected on the split-second decision she had made to abort her first attack. In a different tactical situation, her hesitation might have cost American lives. But, in this case, her caution had prevented what could have been a tragic mistake. "That was good judgment back there," Reynolds said as they headed back to base. "I was so focused on supporting the Rangers that I didn't think about the possibility of civilians in the building. Your decision to use the gun instead of the bomb was the right call." "Thank you, Snake. But I almost hesitated too long." Finding the balance between caution and decisiveness is the hardest part of this job. That's what experience teaches you. And you're gaining that experience faster than most pilots I've flown with. The mission debrief went well, with both pilots receiving praise for their precision and tactical judgment. But, as Sarah walked back to her quarters that evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that her moment of hesitation would somehow be used against her. In the current political climate, any sign of uncertainty or overcaution from a female pilot would be seized upon as evidence that women weren't suited for combat roles. Her fears proved justified the next morning when Major Williams found her at breakfast with a grim expression. "The Pentagon called again last night," he said quietly. "Apparently, someone leaked details of yesterday's mission to the press. There are questions being raised about your decision to abort the first attack run." Sarah felt her blood run cold. "What kind of questions?" "The usual garbage about women being too emotional for combat, lacking the killer instinct, putting political correctness ahead of mission effectiveness. They're spinning your cautious approach as evidence that female pilots can't make the tough decisions when American lives are on the line. That's ridiculous. I neutralized the target with the gun instead of the bomb specifically to avoid civilian casualties while still supporting the ground troops. You and I know that, and so does everyone who understands close air support operations. But politicians and reporters don't necessarily understand the nuances of tactical decision-making. They see hesitation where we see good judgment." The political pressure was building faster than Sarah had anticipated. What had started as murmurs in Washington was becoming a full-scale controversy, fueled by leaked mission reports and sensationalized media coverage. She knew that her enemies were looking for any excuse to remove her from combat flying, and they had apparently found one in her moment of tactical caution. "What's the squadron's position?" she asked. "Colonel Peterson and the wing commander are standing behind you completely. They've made it clear that your performance has been exemplary and that removing you would hurt squadron effectiveness. But there are limits to how much political pressure they can resist." As if summoned by their conversation, Lieutenant Colonel Peterson appeared at their table. "Captain Martinez, I need to see you in my office immediately." The walk to the commander's office felt like the longest of Sarah's military career. She knew that her combat flying days might be about to end, not because of any failure on her part, but because of political considerations that had nothing to do with military effectiveness. Peterson closed the door behind them and gestured for her to sit down. His expression was unreadable, but she could sense the tension in his posture. "Sarah, I'm going to give it to you straight. The pressure from Washington is getting intense. There are powerful people who want you removed from combat flying immediately. Sir, I understand the political situation, but I believe I've proven my value to this squadron. My mission effectiveness has been." Peterson held up a hand to stop her. "You don't need to convince me. Your flying has been outstanding, and your tactical judgment yesterday was exactly what we want from our pilots. But this isn't about military effectiveness anymore. This is about politics, and politics doesn't always make sense from a military perspective." Sarah felt her heart sink. "Are you grounding me, sir?" "Not yet. But I've been ordered to conduct a comprehensive review of your performance and suitability for continued combat operations. The review will take 2 weeks, during which time you'll continue flying missions unless specifically ordered otherwise. 2 weeks to prove that I deserve to keep doing the job I've been doing successfully for the past month." "I know how it sounds, Sarah. But it's the best I can do under the circumstances. Use those 2 weeks to demonstrate beyond any shadow of a doubt that you belong in this cockpit. Make it impossible for them to justify removing you." As Sarah left the commander's office, she knew that the next 2 weeks would be the most important of her military career. The political forces arrayed against her were powerful and determined, but she still had one advantage: the opportunity to prove herself in the air, where performance spoke louder than politics and results mattered more than ideology. The question was whether it would be enough. The call that would define Sarah Martinez's military career came on day 9 of her 2-week review period. She was in the squadron ready room, studying intelligence reports and trying not to think about the political machinations in Washington, when the scramble horn began its urgent wailing. Within seconds, the room erupted into controlled chaos as pilots grabbed their flight gear and raced toward their aircraft. "Mass casualty event," shouted the operations officer over the Din convoy ambush in the Korengal Valley. "Multiple units in contact, heavy casualties. We need every available aircraft airborne immediately." Sarah grabbed her helmet and flight bag, falling in step with Captain Reynolds and Major Williams as they sprinted toward the flight line. The Korengal Valley was known throughout the military as one of the most dangerous places in Afghanistan, a narrow defile where Taliban fighters could attack convoys from the high ground with devastating effectiveness. If multiple units were in trouble simultaneously, the situation was catastrophic. "Martinez, you're flying as my wingman," Williams called over the noise of starting engines. "This is going to be the worst tactical situation we've faced. Are you ready?" "Ready, sir," Sarah replied, though her heart was pounding with a mixture of adrenaline and apprehension. After 8 days of relatively routine missions during her review period, she was about to face the kind of complex, high-stakes scenario that would test every skill she had developed. The briefing was conducted on the run as they headed to their aircraft. A convoy of 23 vehicles carrying supplies and personnel to a forward operating base had been caught in a carefully planned ambush. The enemy had used improvised explosive devices to disable the lead and trail vehicles, trapping the convoy in a narrow section of valley where escape was impossible. Now Taliban fighters on the high ground were raking the trapped vehicles with machine gun and rocket-propelled grenade fire. Initial reports indicate at least 40 casualties, the intelligence officer reported breathlessly as they reached their A-10s. The convoy has broken down into multiple defensive positions, and enemy fire is coming from at least 6 different locations along the ridgelines. Sarah's aircraft for this mission was her familiar 78-0685, the battle-scarred A-10 that had become her regular mount. As she conducted her abbreviated pre-flight inspection, she could see the urgency in every movement of the ground crew. Ordnance was being loaded with rapid efficiency, a full combat load of cannon ammunition, rockets, and precision-guided bombs. "Hog 71, how you doing over there?" Williams called as they strapped in. "Ready to go, lead," Sarah replied, running through her startup checklist with practice speed. The taxi and takeoff were conducted at maximum urgency, and within minutes they were climbing out toward the Korengal Valley. During the flight, Sarah monitored the radio chatter from other aircraft already overhead. The situation was even worse than the initial reports had indicated. Multiple units broken down along a 3-kilometer stretch of road, came the voice of another A-10 pilot already working the area. "Enemy positions are well concealed and have overlapping fields of fire. We've been trying to suppress them for 20 minutes, but they keep popping up in new locations." As they approached the valley, Sarah could see why the Korengal had earned its deadly reputation. Steep ridges rose on both sides of a narrow road, providing perfect firing positions for anyone wanting to ambush traffic below. Smoke was rising from multiple locations along the convoy route, and she could see the scattered vehicles that marked where the ambush had struck. "Dealer 6, this is Hog 71, Williams called to the battlefield controller. "Flight of 2 A-10s checking in with mixed ordnance. What can we do to help?" "Hog 71, thank God you're here," came the strained voice of the ground controller. "We have wounded who need immediate evacuation, but enemy fire is preventing our helicopters from landing. We need those ridgeline positions suppressed before we lose more people." The tactical picture that emerged was nightmarish in its complexity. The convoy had been broken into 4 separate defensive positions, each one pinned down by fire from different enemy locations. Medical helicopters were orbiting nearby, unable to land due to the intense ground fire. Time was running out for the wounded, who needed immediate medical attention that couldn't be provided in the field. "Roger, Dealer 6. We'll work the northern ridgeline first, then move south. Can you identify the most critical threats?" "Hog 71, the primary threat is a machine gun position about 800 meters north of grid 42 SLB 567890. They're preventing movement between our defensive positions and keeping the medevac birds away. Secondary threat is a mortar position further north that's been dropping rounds on our people for the past 30 minutes. Sarah studied the ridgeline through her targeting pod, trying to identify the enemy positions among the jumbled terrain. The northern ridge was a maze of rocks, caves, and vegetation that provided countless hiding places for enemy fighters. Finding specific targets would require patience and careful observation, luxuries they didn't have with wounded soldiers bleeding out below. "I've got movement on the northern ridge," Williams called. "About 300 meters south of where the controller indicated. Looks like they're trying to reposition to get better angles on the convoy." Sarah swung her targeting pod to the area Williams had indicated and immediately saw what he was talking about. Several figures were moving between rocky outcroppings, carrying what appeared to be weapons and equipment. They were too far from the convoy to pose an immediate threat, but their position would allow them to fire down on the defensive positions from a different angle. "I see them too, lead. Want me to take that group while you work the machine gun position?" "Negative. We stick together and work one threat at a time. These guys have had all day to set up interlocking fields of fire. If we split up, they'll concentrate their fire on whichever one of us is attacking." Williams began his attack run on the suspected machine gun position, diving toward the target from the west. The GAU-8 cannon opened fire with its distinctive roar, sending 30mm rounds into the rocky terrain where muzzle flashes had been spotted. The impact area erupted in clouds of dust and flying debris. "Good hits, Hog 71, came the voice of the ground controller. "But we're still taking fire from that position. Can you make another run?" Sarah rolled in for her own attack, targeting the same general area but from a different angle. As she lined up for the gun run, she could see muzzle flashes from among the rocks, proof that enemy fighters had survived Williams' attack and were still in the fight. The GAU-8 crosshairs tracked across the terrain as she refined her aim point. At the proper range, she opened fire, walking her rounds across the suspected enemy position. The 30mm shells exploded among the rocks with devastating effect, sending up clouds of smoke and debris. When she pulled off target and looked back, the muzzle flashes had stopped. "Outstanding work, Hog 72, the controller called. That position is neutralized. But we've got new problems. Enemy fighters are moving down from the high ground toward our southern defensive position. If they get close enough for a direct assault, we won't be able to stop them." The situation was evolving rapidly, with new threats emerging faster than they could be addressed. Sarah could see groups of enemy fighters moving through the rocky terrain, using cover and concealment to work their way closer to the trapped convoy. Some were carrying rocket-propelled grenades, while others had assault rifles and machine guns. "Hog 71, we need to break up those assault groups before they get within grenade range," Williams called. "You take the group moving down the eastern slope. I'll work the western side." Sarah banked toward the eastern ridge, scanning for the enemy fighters who were using every bit of available cover to advance toward the convoy. The tactical challenge was enormous. She needed to stop the assault groups without hitting the friendly forces who were sometimes only a few hundred meters away. "Dealer 6, I need to know exactly where your southernmost position is located," she called. "I'm going to use rockets on the assault groups, but I need to be sure of my safety margins." "Hog 72, our southern position is marked with orange smoke. Danger close is 200 meters from that smoke. The assault groups are approximately 400 meters east of our position, moving down a ravine toward the road." Sarah could see the orange smoke marking the friendly position and quickly calculated the geometry of her attack. The assault groups were moving through a narrow ravine that channeled their advance but also made them vulnerable to area weapons like rockets. If she could place her rockets accurately, she could stop the assault without endangering friendly forces. "Hog 72 and hot with rockets," she called, beginning her attack run. The 2.75-inch rockets streaked toward the ravine, their high-explosive warheads designed to fragment and create casualties over a wide area. The explosions echoed off the valley walls as the rockets detonated among the advancing enemy fighters. When the smoke cleared, the assault had been stopped, but at a cost. "Hog 72, be advised we have civilian casualties from your rocket attack," came an unexpected and chilling transmission from the ground controller. There were local nationals in the target area that we weren't aware of. Sarah's blood turned to ice. The nightmare scenario that every close air support pilot dreaded had just become reality. She had caused civilian casualties. In an instant, all the political pressure she had been facing seemed trivial compared to the knowledge that innocent people had died because of her actions. "Dealer 6, can you confirm civilian casualties?" Williams called, his voice reflecting the shock they all felt. Negative, Hog 71. Stand by for clarification. The next few seconds felt like hours as Sarah waited for confirmation of what she had done. Every pilot knew that civilian casualties were an inevitable part of modern warfare, but knowing that intellectually was far different from being personally responsible for innocent deaths. Hog 72, disregard previous transmission, the ground controller finally called. No civilian casualties. Repeat, no civilian casualties. We have confirmed that all personnel in the target area were enemy combatants. Good effects on target. The relief that flooded through Sarah was almost overwhelming, but there was no time to dwell on the near miss. The tactical situation was still critical, with wounded soldiers needing evacuation and enemy fighters continuing to threaten the convoy from multiple positions. For the next 2 hours, Sarah and Williams worked methodically to suppress the enemy positions that were preventing helicopter evacuation. It was the most complex close air support mission either had ever flown, with threats appearing and disappearing across miles of rugged terrain. They coordinated with multiple ground units, attack helicopters, and other A-10s to create a coordinated suppression effort. The breakthrough came when Sarah spotted the mortar position that had been terrorizing the convoy. Hidden in a cluster of buildings on the northern ridge, the mortar crew had been virtually impossible to locate until she caught sight of the telltale flash of a round being fired. "Lead, I've got the mortar position," she called. Grid 42 SLB 567895, cluster of buildings on the northern ridge. I just saw a muzzle flash. Roger that. You're cleared to engage with precision ordnance. We need to make sure we get them before they can relocate. Sarah selected a GPS-guided bomb from her weapons inventory, a small but precise munition designed for exactly this type of target. She designated the largest building in the cluster, where the muzzle flash had originated, and watched as the bomb guided itself to the target with laser precision. The explosion was devastating but contained, destroying the building while leaving adjacent structures largely intact. When the smoke cleared, there were no more mortar rounds falling on the convoy. "Outstanding work, Hog 72, came the excited voice of the ground controller. "The mortar fire has stopped, and we're finally getting some breathing room down here. Medical helicopters are inbound for evacuation." As the medical helicopters approached the landing zones, Sarah and Williams maintained orbit overhead, ready to engage any new threats that might emerge. The sight of the helicopters touching down to evacuate the wounded was one of the most satisfying moments of Sarah's military career. After hours of intense combat, they had finally created the conditions necessary to save lives. The mission lasted nearly 4 hours, during which Sarah and Williams expended almost all their ordnance in support of the trapped convoy. By the time they headed back to Bagram, the convoy had been extracted, the wounded had been evacuated, and the enemy assault had been completely defeated. "That was some of the finest flying I've ever seen," Williams said as they approached the airfield. "You handled an incredibly complex situation with precision and judgment. Those soldiers are alive because of what you did today." "Thank you, sir. But I keep thinking about that moment when I thought I had caused civilian casualties. It was terrifying. That's what separates good pilots from great ones, the willingness to take responsibility for the consequences of your actions. But you made the right decisions today, and your performance was flawless." As they landed and taxied back to the flight line, Sarah could see that word of their mission had already spread throughout the base. Ground crews, maintenance personnel, and other pilots had gathered to welcome them back, their faces showing the respect and admiration reserved for warriors who had fought and won a desperate battle. The mission debrief took hours, with intelligence officers wanting to understand every detail of the engagement. Sarah's performance was praised by everyone involved, from the ground commanders whose troops had been saved to the pilots who had witnessed her skill and courage under the most challenging conditions. But the real validation came the next morning, when Lieutenant Colonel Peterson called her into his office with a smile she had never seen before. "Sarah, I just got off the phone with Washington," he said. "The review of your performance has been completed ahead of schedule. The conclusion is that you are not only qualified to continue flying combat missions, but that your removal would significantly degrade squadron capability." Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized was there. "Sir, does this mean it means you're here to stay, Captain? The politicians try to use your caution as evidence that women can't handle combat flying. Instead, your performance yesterday proved that you're one of the finest close air support pilots in the Air Force." As Sarah left the commander's office, she knew that she had passed more than just a performance review. She had proven to herself, her squadron, and her critics that the sky truly belonged to anyone brave enough to claim it. The political battles might continue, but her place in the cockpit of an A-10 Thunderbolt II was now secure. The fight for equality in military aviation was far from over, but Sarah Martinez had won a crucial victory, not with words or politics, but with skill, courage, and an unwavering commitment to the mission that defined her as both a pilot and a warrior. 6 months after the Korangal Valley mission that had secured her place in the squadron, Captain Sarah Martinez had become something she never expected, a legend. Word of her performance had spread throughout the close air support community and, beyond, reaching even the F-16 pilots who had initially dismissed her as a publicity stunt. But it was on a cold December morning at Bagram Air Base that the full measure of her transformation would become clear. The mission briefing that day revealed a scenario that would test not just Sarah's skills, but the entire philosophy of air support coordination. A joint operation involving both Army Rangers and British Special Forces had gone catastrophically wrong in the mountains near the Pakistani border. What was supposed to be a quick raid on a high-value target had turned into a running battle across treacherous terrain, with friendly forces scattered across multiple valleys and enemy fighters converging from all directions. "This is the most complex rescue operation we've attempted," Lieutenant Colonel Peterson announced to the assembled pilots. "We have friendly forces in 3 separate groups, all under heavy fire, with enemy reinforcements moving in from multiple directions. Weather is deteriorating rapidly, with cloud cover dropping and winds increasing. This mission will require every aircraft we can put in the air." Sarah studied the tactical display showing the positions of the scattered friendly forces. The Rangers were trapped on a ridgeline in the northern valley, while the British troops had been forced to take shelter in a series of caves on the eastern slope. A third group, a mixed unit of American and British soldiers, was fighting a running battle through the southern approach, trying to reach the extraction point while under constant attack. What made the situation particularly challenging was the terrain. The mountains in this region were some of the most rugged in Afghanistan, with peaks reaching over 4,000 meters and valleys so narrow that aircraft had limited maneuvering room. Add deteriorating weather conditions, and the mission became a test of both flying skills and tactical judgment that few pilots could handle. "Martinez, you'll be leading a 4-ship formation," Peterson continued. "Williams, Davidson, and Reynolds will be your wingmen. The F-16 squadron is providing top cover, but the close support mission is entirely yours." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. Leading a 4-ship formation was a significant step up from her usual 2-ship missions, and coordinating with F-16 top cover added another layer of complexity. But, more importantly, she was being entrusted with the lives of dozens of special operations troops, the elite warriors whose missions required the most precise and reliable air support. As she walked to her aircraft, Sarah noticed something she hadn't seen before. F-16 pilots were gathered near their own aircraft, watching her pass with expressions that had changed dramatically from her early days on base. Where once there had been skepticism and barely concealed hostility, now there was something approaching respect. Some even nodded as she passed, a small gesture, but significant in the warrior culture of military aviation. Her A-10 for this mission was a newer aircraft, tail number 82-0654, freshly arrived from a depot maintenance cycle. The ground crew chief, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, met her at the aircraft with a serious expression. "Ma'am, this bird is loaded for bear," he said, running down the ordnance configuration. "Full cannon load, maximum rockets, and a mix of precision bombs. She's carrying more firepower than any A-10 I've ever configured." "Weather's going to be a factor," Sarah replied, studying the storm clouds building over the mountains. "How's the aircraft handling the extra weight?" "She'll be sluggish on takeoff, but once you burn off some fuel, she'll perform normally. Just remember that your stall speed will be higher with all that ordnance." Sarah conducted her pre-flight inspection with extra care, knowing that any mechanical failure during this mission could have catastrophic consequences. The weather was already beginning to deteriorate, with wind gusts reaching 30 knots and cloud cover moving down from the higher peaks. The other A-10 pilots in her formation gathered for a final briefing near her aircraft. Williams, Davidson, and Reynolds, all seasoned combat pilots who had initially questioned her right to be in the squadron. Now they waited for her tactical guidance with the professional respect that combat experience had earned her. "The terrain is going to be our biggest challenge," Sarah explained, pointing to the mountainous region on her tactical map. "We'll have limited maneuvering room and no margin for error. Weather is deteriorating, so we need to get in, accomplish the mission, and get out before conditions become impossible." Davidson studied the approach routes she had plotted. These valleys are narrow enough to channel our attacks. If the enemy has anti-aircraft weapons positioned correctly, we could find ourselves in a shooting gallery. That's why we're going in as a coordinated formation, Sarah replied. We'll suppress suspected anti-aircraft positions first, then work the threats to the ground forces. The F-16s will maintain top cover and deal with any enemy aircraft that might show up. As they strapped into their aircraft, Sarah could hear the F-16 formation starting their engines on the other side of the flight line. The difference in sound was striking, the high-pitched whine of their single engines contrasting with the deeper roar of the A-10's twin turbofans. Two different philosophies of air power, about to work together in support of troops on the ground. The takeoff was challenging due to the heavy ordnance load and increasing winds, but Sarah's formation got airborne safely and headed toward the mountains. During the flight, she monitored the radio chatter.